organization. Words Ireland is a grouping of 7 literature organisations who have worked together collaboratively since 2015 to provide coordinated professional development and resource services to the literature sector. And this year, Words Ireland came together to improve equality, diversity and inclusion in the sector. So it's done it in a couple of ways. In May this year, in order to better understand the pay, conditions and diversity of the literature sector, Words Ireland surveyed Ireland's writers, illustrators and literature sectors for the first time in over a decade. And over 500 people responded. On the 19th of October, 2 weeks ago, Words Ireland delivered an online presentation of the headline findings, including information on pay, conditions and diversity in Irish literature. There's an awful lot to digest in that report, and you can find it on our website, wordsireland.ie, if you want to take a look at it after this. And as part of this programme of activities, we've been lucky to secure funding from the Arts Council to work with Nolan, who is an independent consultant who works in the area of strategy, diversity and rights, to support our thinking about how we engage with diversity issues across our 7 organisations. Sorry, I just see a request there to turn on live captioning, if that's possible. I don't know, Aoife, if you're able to do that in order to make it more accessible, and we can certainly do that on the recording. So we've been consulting within our own organisations and with our advisory group of 6 writers appointed to help guide the process. And between now and December, we want to open up that discussion before we finalise our procedures and processes in order to take feedback from the wider sector. And that's what these webinar series are about. One element of this work has been to design a charter for inclusion for our organisations that makes clear our commitments to rights, diversity, equality and inclusion. And this charter can be made open for others to adopt if the sector so wishes. And this will be part of the process over the next few months of exploration that we hope to arrive at some kind of conclusion in December. So the mechanism for feedback we're using is these 3 webinars. The series will examine the barriers preventing inclusion in the sector and identify next steps. It will deliver presentations on projects already underway in the Irish literature sector to increase diversity and inclusion, and contributions will come from a wide variety of leaders in the sector and from writers and programmers leading projects for change and inclusion. But today's session is the presentation of a draft charter of inclusion for the sector. The first part of the session today will be a presentation from Nolan of the charter itself and the thinking behind it. And afterwards, I'm going to go to some contributors who've agreed to give their perspective on it. It's an open session, so I invite you to put questions and comments in the chat throughout, and I'll raise them for you. Or if you wish, at the end, you can ask them yourself. You can also put any feedback in the chat, and we will save the chat and review it all afterwards, and it will feed into our charter as it develops over time. And you can also email info@wordsireland.ie if something strikes you in the next few days that you'd like considered. So the first thing I'm going to do now is pass over to Nolan, who's going to take us through this charter and the thinking. So over to you now, Nolan. You're still muted.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I am obviously one of those dinosaurs who cannot share her screen and turn off her camera or her microphone at the same time. Thank you. I'm assuming everyone can see that screen now. Lovely. Someone might give me a thumbs up or a smile. Lovely. I saw Elena smiling. So thank you, Ruth. Thank you for the introduction. For those of you I don't know, as I said, my name is Nolan. You will see, I suppose, traces of my own passion and career coming through this charter and the work that I've been engaged with Words Ireland members. The initial phase of my career was in the field of human rights, both in Ireland and internationally, and then latterly working in arts organisations, and then most recently working, I suppose, at the intersect between arts and human rights, with organisations that are interested in really both their strategic planning and their impact measurement, but specifically their commitment to diversity and inclusion. So that's a little bit about me. As Ruth said, why did we decide to have a charter? There are three elements to this work. Firstly was the discovery. What is going on for underrepresented writers and illustrators and for people in our sector? The second element was the framework, which we've designed with the Words Ireland organisations. And that was really to take a whole of organisation approach to diversity and inclusion. So we recognised from the outset that increasing or improving our practice on diversity and inclusion wasn't just about having more artists represented and more artists being supported, but really taking a root and branch look at our organisations from the board and governance through all of our programs and out the other side. So that's the framework, part two of the program, and part three today is the charter. So we are trying to, in the first instance, think about the organisations in Words Ireland and for them to have a shared set of values and principles. We hope that those values and principles speak to and send a positive signal to both people that are currently working in the sector, to those who want to work in this sector in the 7 Words Ireland organisations, and to underrepresented writers and illustrators. It is very much a work in progress. So I drafted it, I consulted with our advisory group of writers and with the Words Ireland organisations, but today really is its first public outing. So we're very excited about that. And the journey of listening to you all about whether you think this is valuable or not, or where it could be meaningful, or indeed where you feel it's weak or where it needs to be stronger. That journey is as important as the final words on the page. So we really do want to hear from everyone today, and there will be, as Ruth signalled, other opportunities to feedback on the charter as well. One final point for me in terms of the introduction, we deliberately chose a carrot and not a stick approach when we were looking at this charter. And we might be right, we might be wrong, but this is our current thinking. We could have gone down the route of a very explicit code of behaviour, where we say every organisation will do X, Y, and Z and will not engage in X, Y, and Z. And certainly codes like that exist in the literature sector in the UK and in other jurisdictions, and they can be very helpful. I suppose the challenge for us right now is, firstly, Words Ireland is a loose arrangement of 7 organisations, all of which are quite different in their mandate. They don't, for want of a better word, police each other. And within each organisation, they also have their own structures. So some are standalone organisations, some are associations. So we felt that if we went down the route of a code of behaviour saying thou shalt not and thou will always, it would be extremely difficult for Words Ireland to hold themselves and each other to account for that because of the nature of the organisation. But I was also hoping, and as I said, codes of behaviour may come down the road from the Arts Council or from other funders who want to see that organisations have very specific practices and protection measures in place before they'll receive statutory or private funding. So that may still happen. But I suppose for us, I wanted us to start with something that was hopeful without being naive, and that was robust, but without being reductive. That, you know, trying to get words on a page that are actually meaningful, and that we can hold each other to account with them without either being trite or stepping into issues around how each organisation is organised. So that's what we're trying to do, folks. I know you'll tell us today, are we on the right path or not? So before I actually present the text of the charter, for ease of getting through it, and it's not terribly long, but I've structured it around 6 elements. It starts with the power of storytelling. Then it sets out a vision statement for the 7 Words Ireland organisations. Then it specifically talks about the right to participate in the cultural life of your community. And we have taken a very clear human rights-based approach to this work. it sets out our statement on equality. Then it says what action we will be taking. And it finishes with a statement on solidarity. So I'm going to take us through each of those 6 elements. I'm suggesting we don't stop after each one. And if you can put up with the sound of my voice for a little while, there will be about 7 or 8 more minutes of chat as I go through each of those. And then we can discuss it in its entirety. Is that okay for everyone? Okay, wonderful. And you are writers. And you're the trickiest audience to present to because every word counts. And I'm actually clenching gently as I present any words to you. But if a word screams at you off the page, get into the comments box and say, I can't bear that, or look how you phrase that, or that means this to me. Do you know that that means this to me? So go for it, okay? I'm going to give us all a minute now to read the declaration or the charter as it currently stands. I'm just going to sit quietly for 2 minutes while people read it, and then we'll take it through section by section. That's also an object lesson in how much silence we can all tolerate. Probably not much. So I'm going to start with stories, and I'm going to take us through the 6 elements. So we started our charter with the following statement: the stories we tell have the power to change not just the world we live in, but to shape the world we create together for the future. Why do we start with stories as the first element of our charter? Well, as literature organizations, this is the world that we inhabit. We celebrate, we curate, we promote, we tell stories, and we empower storytellers. And in starting this charter, we were very conscious that as organizations with funding and structures and capacity, that we have a lot of power around what stories get told and what storytellers are championed. And as I read through all the literature that was out there on what works when we talk about diversity and inclusion, when you look at things that start as a great initiative but peter off, or projects that start around diversity and inclusion and have longevity, one of the factors was the power of storytelling. So this wasn't coming from the arts, this was coming from the corporate sector, from the wider NGO sector, from the public sector, that the power of individual testimony is the thing that changes and diversity the most. So we can send people on training events and we can raise our awareness about the law and we can do all of those things, but actually human stories are what changes people's perceptions. And so we really wanted to start with an acknowledgement of the power of storytelling and to really harness our own art form as a way into our first steps on the journey towards greater diversity and inclusion. The second part of the charter is the vision statement for the Words Ireland organisations. And I might just rehearse who they are, because I'm not sure we mentioned them at the start of the session. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with Words Ireland, the organisations involved are Poetry Ireland, Children's Books Ireland, Literature Ireland, the Irish Writers' Centre, the Munster Literature Festival, Stinging Fly, and the Irish Writers' Centre. You can see very different organisations, but we wanted to create a vision statement that all of those organisations could buy into. And so our statement here is that we want to create a literature sector in Ireland that is genuinely inclusive, fair, vibrant, and progressive. Fair, vibrant, and progressive, I don't think need a huge amount of explanation, but when we talk about genuine inclusivity, I think we are hyper conscious at the moment that when we discuss diversity and inclusion, we cannot simply invite underrepresented people into a world that has been relatively closed and say that that's our job done. We have many signals at the moment that the world of the arts sector already has a very challenging culture. And we've seen that most recently in the report from the Speak Up Project. So we know there are fundamental challenges in Irish society and that the art sector is not immune to those. So when we talk about genuine inclusivity, we talk about that step beyond diversity, about checking the cultures that we already have within our organizations and ensuring that the spaces we're inviting people into are safe, are fair, and where new voices will actually be heard as opposed to just invited in the door. The next section is on rights. And for those of you who've been working with me for years, it's no surprise that we grounded this in the human right to participation culture. So this is new territory for some people, but actually the human right to participation culture has been around since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's over 70 years old. That declaration gave us things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, as we all know. It also gave us other rights like the right to housing, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and the right to participation culture. Those rights have gone underdeveloped for a very long time, but now there's increasing focus on the right to participation culture. And people will be aware that it is part of the underpinning of the Arts Council statement on equality, human rights and diversity. And we're also now seeing it popping up in different government strategy statements like Culture 2025. What I think is important about this right is it's not simply I have the right to, for example, as a wheelchair user, access the National Theatre. What the right to participate in culture says is that everybody, regardless of age, gender, religion, ethnicity, etc., has a right to be a storyteller and an artist if that is their chosen path in life. They have a right for their stories to be heard and understood, and artists have a right to be remunerated for their work. So we start with the right to participation culture as a shared value across the World's Ireland organisations as a touchstone, not least because the Irish state signed up to it in 1989. We could have a whole other webinar on the Irish state and its human rights obligations, and I'll happily have that chat with people who want to, but this is our groundwork. I find if I ever get lost in the debates, I go back to the human rights framework, and that's where we've gone with this as our grounding point. Our statement on equality, I think, is quite clear. We commit to ensuring that through our individual and collective actions, that no one is denied the right to participate in culture on the basis of gender, sexual orientation, civil or family status, religion, age, disability, race, membership of the travelling community, or socioeconomic status. So you'll recognise these grounds, you'll recognise that they come from the equality legislation in Ireland, and you'll recognise the final ground, the 10th ground, socioeconomic status, is an area where the Arts Council have been progressive and where national legislation is beginning to catch up. And then action. So this is our penultimate section in the Charter. This really does come from the framework that I talked to you about. So in parallel, as I mentioned, we've got Heather's research on what's actually happening in the sector. We have the Charter, which is a public statement, and then the homework, if you like, that the Words Ireland organisations and myself have been doing is a framework for how do we really approach diversity and inclusion in a systemic way within our organisations. Where we're doing that, we developed a framework to look at our organisations and said we have to look at organisations through their governance, who's on their board, how do they hire people, how do we organize our spaces and physical access, what are our programs with artists, what are our programs with our audiences, and how do we measure our impact? So really what this point commits us to is to say that we can't just be declaratory around diversity and inclusion. And it's not just about the programs that we do with artists or audiences. It's a root and branch approach to our thinking. And we're going through that process in each of the Words Ireland organisations at the moment, doing a diversity inclusion health check, if you like. And we hope that that work might be valuable to other people in the sector in the future. So I suppose this penultimate point around action is it's a commitment to critical self-assessment and to all of us really valuing the process of learning and valuing the changes that we're going to have to take if we're going to be truly committed in this area. And then finally, and you'll be glad to be at finally in the sound of my voice, there are many other voices today, is our statement on solidarity. And how this currently reads is, we recognise that even as we make our organisations more open, people will continue to experience discrimination, racism and exclusion in their daily lives. Thus, we will stand in solidarity with the people we support, amplifying their voices and robustly renouncing any denial of their rights. For me personally, I think this is going to be the most challenging part to get right. It's important that we do get it right, and the words are important, but the action is more important. This final section was really inspired by what we've been hearing from artists about their experience of finding themselves with a platform as an artist finally, and the backlash that they have to face, whether that's racism, sexism, ableism, or sheer nastiness, and particularly online, but not limited to online. So we know that even as we try and improve and enhance our own learning within our organizations, the artists that we work with, and indeed our own staff, are living in the real world, and the real world in Ireland right now has many challenges. And so we were reflecting on, when we work with an artist and that artist then finds themselves the subject of abuse, what is our role and what is our duty of care? I suppose some of the challenges in getting this right will be sometimes people will experience things that are not 100% clear cut. Sometimes there will be challenges that may end up in legal actions. And organizations will have to take good advice on how to actually not interrupt those processes. But ultimately, we want to find a way to stand shoulder to shoulder with the artists that we work with, and that we don't simply give people a stage and then walk away. So we present this very humbly today and very self-consciously, I would say. And this is our best attempt, our best thinking so far. But today is really the start of the conversation. I'll take questions throughout the day, and there are many other better informed speakers than I that are also going to offer feedback. So I'm going to hand back to Ruth for now.
Thank you very much, Nolan, and thanks for presenting it so well. And you can feel that there is a depth of thought behind it. So now I suppose I'm going to go to a few different individuals to get different perspectives on it, people who've been involved in the process, to just tease out some of those different lines in the charter and to get a little bit of feedback. But again, I encourage you, if you have any comments or thoughts or questions, please do put it in the chat, and we can ask them as we go along. So first of all, I was going to go to Owen de Vardoon. He was on our advisory group. He's a writer and a member of the travelling community. And Owen, could you talk a little bit about your engagement with the charter. And of course, as a storyteller, that first idea, that first line in the charter talks about the power of stories and of hearing different stories and the empathy that it can create. And of course, you've got your beautiful book, Why the Moon Travels, which celebrates these amazing stories and opened up a whole world to me, which I thought was fantastic. So can you talk a little bit about the process and how you see this charter might be valuable?
Yeah, I will indeed. And thanks very much, Ruth, and also to Nolan for bringing us through the charter itself. I think for myself, I'd like to start with a quote by a travel activist called Catherine Joyce, and her quote is, "That which is timely is usually greatly overdue." And I think that by capturing that as well, to say that is not to dismiss this process, but to know that it's something that innately we all know should have happened before, but still I'm very much thankful that's happening now. When we're talking about the process, one of the first aspects I witnessed myself and experienced myself, and we even discussed it earlier today before coming on, was anxiety. And that anxiety actually is very important to me, which means that people were invested in wanting to make this happen, wanting to make this work, wanting it to be more than just a piece of paper with ideals, actually to be very authentic, open, I suppose, discussion rather than being told, or which is very much in line with our sense of having our own voice and our narratives, our own stories. That the charter itself needs to be not just now but ongoing, a living discussion that we're forever conscious of. But that anxiety is something that I think that will stand testimony to it, because language in itself is limited, and it does not always support the ideals in which we want to inspire and, I suppose, encase within our foundations. But also comes to the sense of commitment, and commitment, like making sure that we review it and who it's reviewed by, but also is it inspiring the needed and required structural changes. I have to say I was quite surprised and welcomed by the fact that it was proactive in many spaces, because, for instance, by being told that you're welcome to a space doesn't mean that space is welcoming or safe for you. And actually, by tracing out those ideas and understandings, ensure that a welcome is actually an authentic welcome, and makes a very big difference, rather than we're inspiring to be diverse, is passive, rather than we are ever dedicated and committed to being diverse and continuing that journey. Because I think that we should never carry the ignorance of assuming that we have reached a destination when this is an ever-changing landscape for us all. And also, I think that it's very important that throughout the process is that I was very aware that I'm from a deeply unrepresented group that doesn't have that much societal power within our societies. And I felt very open to being very critical of the process and being very critical of things like the charters, because it needs it. And I think that's something that we should all feel comfortable, because this is literally an offering up of this is what we've struggled and have been anxious in designing, and that we want to make better. And the only way that is made better is that we continue to expand those narratives, expand those stories, and expand those understandings. And that is something that I do feel that is at heart a commitment, but it's something that we also need to be forever critical on going forward, because there's a whole lifetimes of discrimination, rejection, isolation, in anything from orientation to ethnicity to gender. And like, we're not going to turn that tide in the single charter, but that charter can be a very strong compass for how we engage with each other and going forward. So what I really is saying that I've enjoyed the openness of the discussions. I thought it very important that we created spaces that people could be anonymous as well as being identified. But that critique is something that's actually not only welcomed, but it's actually something that's required. Because not all people can be all things to everyone. And it's similar with this charter, but it is a point of seed that can grow if we do allow it to be watered by our own inspirations, goodwill, but also commitment, and monitor commitment to that change. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And then just another element of feeding into the process, I was going to ask you, Heather, to talk a little bit about the report that you wrote for us on understanding the pay conditions and diversity of the literature sector in Ireland. Just to get a short sense of what the barriers were for people and what was identified within that, because that feeds into our conversation about how do you make these words actually real, and how do you embed it in all of our 7 organizations and in the wider sector?
Yeah, thank you. Well, without doubt, the biggest barrier to both entry and to career development into the sector is low pay, and the implications of low pay, by far and away the biggest issue. And just to illustrate that for you, in 2019, if you look at mid-career and established writers, their median gross income from creative work was just €2,000. And okay, a lot of them have portfolio careers where they're looking at work related to their writing. Well, that didn't help much, because the median gross income from that was €1,000. So it's really an extreme issue that people who have made writing their careers and illustrating their careers and have been in the sector for several years are earning so little. It's impossible to take that risk, though, if you don't have any other sources of income. So if you look at income from all sources, not just writing and illustrating, those writers and illustrators who responded, half of them earned less than a total of €20,000 from everything, total income. And if we kind of try and relate that to living in Dublin, where the majority of the sector is focused, that becomes particularly interesting. Half of sector workers earned less than €29,000. And the pandemic affected disproportionately underrepresented groups within the sector. So if we look at the median gross income from all sources, the midpoint, those from underrepresented groups, it went down by 18%. And for those not from underrepresented groups, it went down by 7%. And then if you look at that, extra work designed to, shore up your income from work not related to writing or illustrating, it dropped by 29% for underrepresented groups. And for those not from underrepresented groups, it remained steady. There was no drop at all. But I do think it's important, though, to underline that underrepresented does not mean automatically disadvantaged. So 9% of writers and illustrators and 7% of sector workers earned more than 60,000, and that included respondents from underrepresented groups. So we need to make quite kind of nuanced actions in response to the data, because not everybody is the same. And it became very clear that underrepresented groups, the people within those groups, were very, very varied, and some had well-established careers and some were struggling to enter the sector. So the actions that we have to take to overcome barriers need to be nuanced and not one size fits all.
Yeah, and I suppose for me that emphasizes the fact that it is likely to be very difficult to access if pay is a barrier. If you need to be able to survive, then this charter needs to be a living document and to be something that can continue to be around for a long period of time, and for there to be transformation and change, and for us all to learn. Because, even in this case here, we don't have live captions going on, and we should have had that. And, that's an oversight that we have, that we've made, and we will rectify it the next time. But even in each of those kinds of things, each time we're learning, and fully acknowledge we should be better at it already. But this process will be, we hope, useful if everybody in the sector can come together and work on it. So one of the things that I wanted to do now was to talk to one or two of the organisations in Words Ireland about their own work in equality and diversity and inclusion. And Valerie Bastani's the director of the Irish Writers Centre. So we've just spoken to a writer, and then we've also heard about the main barriers. So Valerie, can you give us your perspective and where you are with this process now?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Well, I suppose from our point of view at the Irish Writers Centre, I think we embraced a whole of organisation approach before we even started this work with Nolan. And the working with her has just reinforced and helped us to expand our breadth. So just to give you kind of examples of what we've been doing is that we had an EDI, an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statement as a holding document, knowing that this charter was coming along to kind of guide us. But immediately afterwards, we started any calls that we had out. We would make sure that there was a statement which included diversity, also Irish language, so it was reaching out to underrepresented groups. And that really paid dividends. We've done this with our calls for recruitment and also on our board. And now we do have a more diverse team. We have people of color on our board and on our team at the moment. And we've also created a number of bursaries. This was from the start of the pandemic, which were designed and directed at underrepresented groups. So all of those things have been happening really for the last 2 years. So apart from, as Owen said, a welcome doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to come into you or feel welcome. So part of our thinking at the moment is how do you reach out, how do you change attitudes at a sectoral level. And one of the things that we've got coming up at the end of the week, we're going to be advertising a call for reaching out to young leaders of color in literature. It's a program called Uplift, and it will be it's going to be done with an organization in the UK called Words of Color. So it's that thing of inviting people in, but also reaching out. And another way that we're trying to do that is through a current program that we have at the moment called Evolution with Professional Writers. We're having discussions as a forum group on diversity in writing. So that writers themselves are beginning to think about diversity and to raise awareness, but also learn how to write, I suppose, adequately and with respect and without misappropriation about characters of color, characters that are underrepresented. So I suppose to have a creative element where we're also addressing diversity issues. So I suppose we are trying to signal a message, but also to do it through the creative work that we're doing, through the calls that we're sending out, and through the recruitment process. So that in a nutshell is what we're about. And obviously our board is now looking at the charter and, we're taking that on board, literally. That's enough from me, I think.
Yeah. So this year's you're starting to address it in that multifaceted way that the line in the charter talks about, that it's a root and branch, it's organizational, it's not just about programming, it's not just about commissioning, it's about HR, it's about all the various levels in the organization. Yeah. And then I wanted to bring you in, Brendan Machiavelli, because you, I think, are doing a discrete piece of work this year on addressing some elements of the pay and conditions, not a solution. But can you talk a little bit about the work that you'll be doing next year?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose to say that what we have already, Words Ireland created a document back in 2015, a pay scales document, and it lists the pay of the pay for discrete pieces of work offered by the 7 members of Words Ireland. So I'll share that link in a couple of minutes. But that, I suppose, that document has been the most shared of all the things, initiatives that Words Ireland has done or created, documents we've created. That's been the most shared, the most referenced. Writers reference it in their negotiations with maybe other organizations who aren't familiar with paying writers, or aren't familiar, don't know what writers get paid for different pieces of work. It's a good guide. But even in creating this document, the Words Ireland members were like careful. They knew that they weren't able to police, they're not saying this is what everyone should pay, this is just the minimum figures we pay to writers, and it can be used as a guide. And even the Arts Council are reluctant, if you like, to police this area. They don't want to set minimums, and while, you know, if they see an application come in where someone's suggesting they pay writers exorbitantly low figures, obviously they you know, have the right to refuse those applications, but they do not state specifics or minimums, and they won't police other organizations. So I suppose what myself and Danny Gill, our piece of work we're working on next year independently from Words Ireland, is, I suppose, a longer document created from the viewpoint of writers. So we'll have an expert panel of writers feeding in, and we'll get their perspective. So, and again, while they can't police it, they'll be giving their experience and saying what they think they should be paid for a discrete piece of work. And maybe I think we'll need to talk about things like, you know, other barriers to the sector for sectoral workers, such as unpaid internships, or, you know, long-term volunteering situations, you know, which are ultimately, you know, prohibit people on lower incomes from entering the sector. And so we'll be looking at a much wider range of ways in which writers get paid, and I suppose we'll be sharing that document when it's available. Another thing I suppose I'll be sending writers out on is whether they'd like to see from literature sector organizations a page on their website, so that lists what those organizations pay for a discrete piece of work. So that, I think, transparency definitely benefits writers when it comes to pay, knowing what they're going to get paid before they accept a job or before they approach an organization for work. The opposite of transparency, secrecy, I suppose, is definitely, you know, it definitely hinders them in their negotiations. And I think that, you know, there's, even for writers who are in the sector for quite a while, they may not know what, you know, the range of advances are for their books, books until it's offered to them. So even people who've been in the sector quite a while don't really are uncertain about what a fair rate of pay is, or what they have a right to ask for in terms of travel or accommodation, or, you know. So I guess we need to make that clear and inform writers as much as possible, but also call on the literature sectors to proactively inform writers about what they pay and what their conditions are.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the work that Valerie's doing and then the work that you're doing demonstrates some of the changes in the sector that are coming, and the pay issue is an iterative process. So you're seeing policies, you're seeing just words on websites, but they are transforming slowly into action and into improvements. And so we hope that the Charter of Inclusion will do something similar to that. Nolan, can I just check in with you? Do you have any comments or anything, and then we'll maybe move on to Joanna from Publishing Ireland?
Thank you, Ruth. Yes, I suppose it's great to hear Heather tell those stats again so boldly about earned income, both for writers, but also for those working in the sector. And, you know, it's a trite example, but the one that I often cite when we're talking about this in training sessions is, if you are a lone parent and you're paying rent and creche fees and living in Dublin, you can't take a job in the art sector. You'd be very hard pressed to be the sole income earner and pay rent and creche in Dublin. And if you're faced with those sort of financial barriers and you try to make a living from writing, or you even try to have time for your writing, that's almost impossible. And I think sometimes if we bring it back to those basic economics of the reality of the sector, it is really important. So that's the first thing I want to say. And then just briefly, Owen, thank you for quoting Catherine. I think that'll stay with me for a while now. That which is timely is usually overdue. I couldn't agree with you more about the living nature of the language, and also, I suppose, the risk of the language when I'm working on projects with this with people. There is a huge sense of anxiety about people getting things wrong, you know, and a lot of the people leading the debates are white middle-aged women with a university degree who don't want to take up space, but equally want to start the debate somewhere. And so at a practical level, one of the things that Owen or Brendan and I have been discussing is that for Words Ireland, or indeed for any other organisation that might choose to sign the final charter that emerges from this process, that we should have an annual debate about the charter, a really meaningful one where we say, okay, are those words still meaningful? What went well? What did we get wrong? And so that we keep the language alive and up to date, but we also really test ourselves to make sure that we're open to critique. So I guess what I'm saying, Ruth, is the charter it's only starting today, and there'll be a process till the end of the year until we sort of finalise and polish it for Words Ireland. Others may join, but if they do, then that conversation only starts then. It can't die on a web page somewhere. It has to be a live debate between us. It has to be a curated and very open conversation.
Yes, and in the hard-pressed, underfunded sector, that's one of the biggest challenges, is to keep this going along with the day jobs that people are working. So it's really important. Joanna, can I go to you? So you're not president of Publishing Ireland, apologies. Can you talk to us about the process that you've gone through with Publishing Ireland and your reaction, or your work with the charter?
Sorry, I was just very frightened there. I get another recording warning. Yes, thanks, Ruth. And just to make clear, I wasn't impeached or anything. It's just my term as presidency ended a couple of months ago. I really, really liked that sort of image that Owen created of the idea of the charter as a compass. I think that, you know, it's really something that, you know, can be sort of held in our minds and should be held in our minds as we work through this process, but also in our day-to-day actions as organizations. As you mentioned, Ruth, at the beginning of this, and also Nolan mentioned, each of the organizations within Words Ireland are quite different. And so while we're all supportive of this collective charter, the actual wording of a charter for each organization might be a little different depending on the work that you do, but the ideas, of course, are the same. And I think it's really thinking about that as both a compass, a touchstone, and also a strategy. How can these words and actions imbue the activities you're engaged in and the conversations you're engaged in? You know, Nolan keeps talking about storytelling, and I think that's such an important part of this process is to just keep sharing experiences, you know. And as a membership organization, something that Publishing Ireland does and can do as part of this process is to really just open up more space for conversation among the people working in our membership publishers, you know, really to talk to them about their experiences and to give them the space to air their anxieties and concerns, their kind of fears around making mistakes, as you know, as we've discussed, and to really talk about that idea of culture and how welcoming do we feel the sector is to underrepresented people, and you know, how can we engage in that conversation to, you know, improve things. And then also Publishing Ireland as a board, how can we keep inclusivity in mind, and how can we consider it when it comes to our activities? For example, we have a training program. How can we make sure that our training is as accessible as possible? That might be, you know, instead of moving fully back to in-person training events next year, hopefully, if circumstances allow, that we keep online events as part of our remit to allow people, you know, greater access, that we, you know, make sure that captioning is in place, as you mentioned, you know, all those sorts of things that it could, you know, be part of our activities as well. So, I mean, it is very much start of a process, start of a conversation for us. but I think it's obviously very, very important work, and I think the point at which we're at is sort of really beginning that conversation.
Yeah, and then Michael McLaughlin of Penguin Sandy Cove, you've probably been part of these conversations, have you, in Penguin more broadly? Have you seen good initiatives coming out of the UK that would be useful to talk about now or contribute to the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely, Ruth, and thanks for inviting me along, and thanks and well done, Nolan. Just to echo, I think, just what you just said there before I forget, the annual debate about the Charter, I think, is very important to keep it kind of front and centre. Overall, I think it's great that Words Ireland have pushed this Charter, and the couple of lines that jumped out at me, the literature sector does not reflect the diversity of wider Irish society. It's important that we now have evidence that that is the case, and we can refer to that. I think it's really important because there are naysayers out there who don't want to hear that. And then I suppose also the other line about discrimination and harassment, that 10% of writers and illustrators stated unprompted that they face discriminatory attitudes within the literature and publishing sector, including ageism, racism, sexism, bullying, sexual harassment, and negative attitudes to diversity. That's very important as well. To be honest, I'm surprised it's actually that low. I suspect it's probably I wouldn't be surprised if it's higher than that. I think they're important to recognise. I think just from my point of view, wearing my kind of penguin hat, I think it's important to say that for those people in the commercial sector, being diverse does not mean you can't be commercial, and there are also ways of doing things and bringing this front and center in small ways and big ways that you can tackle the lack of diversity. I think, as a company, we've set demonstrable targets both in the UK and in Ireland, to be more representative of society. And I think, all of us can do things in our day-to-day actions, both privately and publicly, in our organisations, to be more representative of Irish society. For instance, things like when we're hiring people, we take on board that, and when we're acquiring our books. And so one of the things we've done in the last year or so is send out a questionnaire to all the authors that come to us for the first time, asking them specific questions about that, so that we can track the diversity and make sure that we're reaching the targets that we're setting ourselves to be more diverse. We welcome and celebrate that diversity, across the company, just within the office, starting out and outside, in how we commit to engaging with people we work with. Obviously this sector engages a lot of freelance people, and we are committed to expanding that pool of freelancers, not just sitting back and talking and working with the same people we've worked with for the last 10 or 20 years. That it is important to engage with new people and expand that pool of, be it ghostwriters or co-writers, marketeers, publicists, proofreaders, copywriters, indexers, designers, photographers, illustrators. Like there are lots and lots of ways that we can be more open to diversity once it's front and center. And we review this frequently, and we talk about it a lot within the business, and so that it has to be led, and it has to be led from the top. So the people I work for talk about a lot. I talk about it here in the Irish office, and colleagues are continually aware that that being diverse is important, and and the fact that this topic has been probably talked about a bit more in the UK and in previous years doesn't mean that we can sit back and think that we're virtuous and fantastic. We have an opportunity to get ahead, I think, over the next few years, and I think this initiative from Words Ireland is to be welcomed, and it's great that this is the first seminar, and there are more to come. And as and to repeat myself again, just to say, I think Nolan's objective that there's an annual debate, it should be at least that, and it just should be in everything we do. So I'm not saying we're perfect, we're definitely not, but and we've definitely more to do. But I just looked over the lists of books that we have coming up for the next 12 months. And we have at least 3 titles from authors who in previous years we might not have published at all, and are definitely, in that more diverse area from, via if it's disability or age or ethnicity. And, I'm really proud that we're doing that. And hopefully those books will get to a wide audience. And that's important for us to do that. So the other publishers and other people, be it writers and people in the sector, can see that this type of publishing does work, and readers are out there who want to read these kind of books. So so that's really all I want to say. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Very interesting. This 10% that were recorded of having experienced discrimination, and then the Irish Theatre Institute's work and survey seeing far more people seeing very troubling action in the workplace. The last section of the charter, Nolan, can you talk a little bit more about how you see what those implications are? Because, it could be motherhood and apple pie, or it could be quite a strong statement if we're to adopt this charter. How might we do that? What does stand in solidarity mean, do you think?
Yeah, and thank you, Ruth. I think the first time this really became very clear to me was when Felicia Speaks was on primetime. So RT did this great research-based documentary midway through the pandemic, where they talked about, attitudes and behaviour. And it was a slice of Irish life, but they made a really interesting artistic choice. And Felicia opened the show with an incredible piece of performance poetry. And afterwards, I heard that there had been really awful racist commentary directed at Felicia because of that particular performance. And it made me think, when we offer artists a stage, right now, the organisations in Words Ireland have, as much as everyone is overworked and struggling, they're also funded by the state and accountable to the taxpayer, but also we're accountable to the artists that we support. So when we do support someone and something like that happens, where do we go with it? So it could be something as simple as organisations internally have very clear communication strategies on racism, on sexism, on comments that appear on their website, and they're able to manage those. Again, at an operational level, it may be that you have an emergency comm strategy. So what do we do if and when? Because if and when will happen. And shutting down conversations and shutting down threads that are absolutely not tolerable. So that's a very pragmatic thing. I think what's trickier is when we will get into spaces where criticisms are less clear, or indeed where that criticism is of your own organisation, where someone's saying, well, actually, organisation X or event Y was where I was subject to inappropriate behaviour. And how we police that is much more challenging. But I don't think we can shy away from the conversation either. So it started with that place of, we live in the real world, and Michael will have a good sense of this, and anyone who's worked in the UK. One of the criticisms of the diversity and inclusion strategies in the UK is there's been 30 years of them, but very little has changed societally. Ireland's a very small country, so I'm very hopeful that, I'm not being naive about it, but I'm very hopeful about the power of the art sector to get this right and to be really robust in its voice, and to recognise that the art sector isn't in a chasm. Everyone lives and works in a country that is rife with racism and attack and all of those. It's just finding the voice for arts organisations in that. And it may be as simple as thinking about it in terms of our duty of care. What is our duty of care to our staff? What is our duty of care to our audience? What is our duty of care to the artists that we work with? And taking at least responsibility for that. So I'm not convinced, Ruth, that we have the right frame of words yet in that solidarity section, but I'm really keen that we have that debate.
Yeah, now I'd love to hear comments from anyone that I haven't gone to yet, anyone in the audience. Mia, I see, say a little bit about pay and conditions in the chat. If you want to come in, please do. If anyone wants to make any suggestions, for example, about what next, these ideas of it, how do we make sure that it would be a living document? How might we ensure that it develops over time? There's one question in here for Michael. Want to take that? It's from Chandrika, just asking if you have 3 people on your list that you may not have published before. Why is that? As you know, presumably has your idea of the market shifted, or that's from Michael McLaughlin. Is he? I don't actually see him there now. Sorry, Chandrika. So I'll come back to that, or maybe we'll pass it on to him. Yeah, does anyone have any comments about how to make this kind of a living working document? Mia, I see you've got your video on there. Do you want to make a comment about pay or conditions? You're muted. If you unmute yourself, and I'll mute myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is the possibility for maybe reaching out to, and I don't know where Words Ireland stands on this. Brendan, I suppose, talking to Brendan about this, but the Writers Guild, which represents playwrights and screenwriters, while technically it's media and technically it may not be exactly the same sector, there is an overlap with playwrights being, you know, certainly recognized as literature practitioners as well as theatre practitioners. So they have, I mean, I think one of the things around lack of transparency is it doesn't feel very joined up. So like, for example, one festival may pay writers 100 quid to appear, and another festival may pay writers 300 quid to appear. So the more communication there is between various organizations, and so I'd be quite interested to know what thoughts, if any, Words Ireland have around consulting with the Writers Guild or talking to them.
Yeah, I think we can certainly look into that, and in the next webinars we'll have presentations from different organizations, so they're not involved in those, but we can certainly consult with them and see, and I think maybe Brendan in his work might be able to consult with them.
Yeah, I suppose just to say that there'll be a research piece that myself and Danny will be involved in next year, and looking at documents already out there in Ireland and abroad, and we certainly look at the work that is happening in theatre and film and any other relevant field in drawing up our document.
Okay, great. And then just going back to you, Michael, sorry about that, but just that shift in commissioning is interesting. You know, so that's one element of the charter, the organisation of the root and branch. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how you might have commissioned people that are on your list for next year that you may not have commissioned a few years ago?
Yeah, I suppose it's hard to know whether we wouldn't have published these authors before, but I think what we are is more open to more diverse voices. And sometimes it's the small things that you don't even think about. You know, somebody pointed out to me in London a couple of weeks ago that in the division I'm in, we're this month we've published 3 authors in their 80s. And one of those books is a book that we've published. It's Anne Ingall's memoir. And I suppose when we were buying and publishing that, we didn't think it was diverse, but they in the UK see that as diverse. That is very difficult for older writers, particularly in the 70s and 80s, to get published, be it for the first time or whatever. And I suppose I was kind of happy in a way that we hadn't thought of it as such. And I think if we get to that stage with other kind of diverse elements, well, then that's a victory. You know, I've looking at the 3 titles for next year. You know, one of them is from somebody who is of a minor ethnicity here in Ireland. There's also is disabled, so they've got kind of a double issue, I suppose. But the book is compelling and interesting, and we think there's a market for it. You know, we're a commercial publisher, so we're not in a position to. We don't get or ask for grants from the Arts Council or help from the Arts Council. So we do need to sell a certain number of copies to make it work for us. But I suppose what we're thinking is that this book is so well written and so interesting that lots of people will want to read it, and we're hoping obviously that people who aren't diverse will read it. And we think that, you know, the world has moved on and Ireland has moved on a lot in the last few years. And so I think it's hard to be definitive, because maybe if this book had come in 5 years ago, we would have gone for it at that time. You can only publish what you're, you know, given at the time. And I'd hope that these diverse elements don't become, you know, discussion points in the future as such, that just basically it's just good writing from good writers, and that hopefully they'll gain a good and large readership. But that's what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so you're seeing this shift in the understanding of what the market is, what the market, you know, who will be interested in buying it, that the market is potentially expanding, or the understanding of the market is expanding.
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think that is the case, and I just think we're more open to not perceiving our core market as the market to publish into, and that core market being, you know, mainly you know, women, you know, between the ages of 30 and 60, which is you know, they're the main kind of buyers of books in Ireland. And there are lots of other, you know, large sectors and large numbers of people who buy books, and we want to publish for them as well. And I'm not suggesting that's who we only publish, or that's what we used to only publish for in the past, but it was always, you know, well, what's the core market for this book? And now we try and say, well, you know, that might be a core market, but there are other markets as well, and how do we get to them? And that plays out in how we, you know, package a book. To use that terrible term, it also plays out in how we market and publicize, in, you know, the kind of outlets that we would ask an author to write for or do interviews with or whatever. So it's about expanding your horizons, and we've tried to do that in a way, you know, I suppose more in a more open way in the last couple of years than maybe we had heretofore.
Yeah, and that then responds to the research in Heather's report, which says if you can grow the sector, if you can grow the amount that you publish, or you grow the market in any way, then it will become more vibrant fundamentally. A couple of other questions there. I think there's one here that I might pass over to you, Nolan, which is, could it not be stronger, the Charter? And what about actions? Are there going to be any actions associated with this? So if you take yourself off mute there.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. I think, and one of the specific, I think that was from Grania and Nolan Skeen. Yeah, Grania, I think I'm over assuming what people understand by the right to participation culture there. And that phrase is what the legal language is, but it can seem quite reductive. Oh, you can participate. Asher, you can come on in. Whereas actually the content behind it is about meaning making, is about the recognition of cultures, about creating new cultural identities, all of that. So it's much richer. And I think, so to your first point, Grania, I think absolutely we need to reflect on, when we say the right to participate in culture, to actually point out much more boldly what that means in terms of cultural identity, recognition of cultures, but also meaning making and people together making new stories. And that's why it was in the human rights framework, because access to culture, access to science were seen as two sides of the one right, and all of them seen as fundamental to democracy. So I think I need to revisit that and take my ex-amnesty worker, I assume everybody has the same crazy passion for this as me, lens off, and rewrite it from the point of view of culture. So thanks for that, Grania. On your second point, will there be targets and actions arising directly from this charter? I think it is unlikely right now, because we're still very much at this stage of getting each of the 7 Words Ireland organisations debating it among themselves. However, I think what is likely to emerge is that each organization individually will increasingly start stating what their targets are, whether that's the number of underrepresented writers that they're publishing, how they're funding, what their diversity strategy is on their board. And to that point, we've created in the framework for this project a checklist, like a health check of if you're actually checking the changes that your organization has made in diversity and inclusion. Have your board debated it? Do you have a value statement? Have you incorporated this into your HR strategies? Do you have a budget? Do you publish annually your statement on this? So I don't think there will be a collective Words Ireland, because I don't think Words Ireland is that type of structure, but I leave that to other words I work for and with, but I'm not part of Words Ireland. But I do think there is something within the framework that we've created that will allow each of the Words Ireland organisations to be much more explicit about what they're meant to do. And that speaks to something else that came up in the comment box, at the risk of hogging the stage for a second. Someone was commenting, wouldn't it be great to see something like this permeate through the local authorities? And I would reference something called public sector duty. If you're a statutory body, if you get most of your money from the state, you have a public sector duty to not discriminate. So the 9 grounds. And it goes more than that. So have a look at what the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission say on this. You have a duty to assess how you are responding to the 9 grounds. You have a duty to set out what actions you're going to take, and you have a duty to report on it. And while that's the duty on state bodies, I think it's a very helpful health check for everybody was, have we asked the question? Have we said what we're going to do? And are we reporting on that? So anyone who's saying, I have a statement on diversity and inclusion is beautiful and starts conversation, but it's absolutely meaningless without a list of actions and money and reporting behind it. And then just one final point, Michael, I loved what you had to say, and it reminded me of another report that I'll put the name of it in the comment box, called Rethinking Diversity in Publishing, that was published in the UK, I think 2018. I found it a really useful starting point for this project, because it really talks about the commercial publishing sector in the UK. And I think there's a lot for us to reflect on how much of it is true here. But it does that from the moment that we find an author, through to how the work gets critiqued, through to how it gets published, through to how it gets promoted, through to what shelf and what section of the book shop it goes in. There are questions about diversity and inclusion. And I think that's a great report. And it does give that whole, you have to think about the life cycle of how you're working with writers, and recognize that our own lenses put people in boxes every single step of the way there. But that's a great report that I'd recommend people have a look about. And Elena's just posted the reference for it. Thanks, Elena.
And following on from that, Nolan, can you talk a little bit then about how a charter like this might interact with those dreadful terms like a KPI? Like, how do you measure impact? Because it has shifted from, we've had 2 writers and 55 audience members. How would you recommend people go about approaching that?
Yeah, well, we can certainly make elements of the framework was very much written internally for the Words Ireland organisations, but there are elements of it that we could probably pull out, like the checklist for people. We took a very particular approach, but I would say as you view your organisation, starting with your governance and all the way through your operations, and then how you interact with artists and audiences and out into the public. There are questions about how are we including our diversity initiative in here, and do we actually know the difference that we're making? So a lot of organizations, and it's endemic in our sector because organizations have multiple donors and they're racing all of the time, but sometimes they don't stop and check what they're doing, and they don't report on it. So for example, one of the challenges for organizations is actually having any sort of data, any sort of insight into who they're working with. And through this project, it's become clear to us that you are absolutely legally entitled to ask questions on the grounds of discrimination. And you should do it in order to actually know the direction that you're moving in. But then we also try and offer insights into how to do that appropriately, how to do it in a way that's compliant with GDPR, how to do it in a way that actually builds the confidence of the people you're asking, as opposed to saying, aha, you're a person who already experiences multiple discriminations in Ireland. We'd just like to ask you a few more questions again, because people are, I think it was Nolan Blackwell that said it first, and it's borne true over the years. The more barriers you face in Ireland, the more questions you have to answer just to get some basic rights. So we always have to get the sweet point between them. But if you can't measure it, then you're probably not doing it. And that measurement doesn't have to be a big fancy Salesforce system, but you have to be able to measure your activity and build time for reflection and reporting into your work. You know, there's a real risk, I guess, of, I suppose, two different ways that this debate could go in Ireland. Either we reduce it all down to statistics and everybody has to report on how many, and I give the example, Fighting Words are brilliant on this. They say, we don't count how many traveller children show up to our events. We co-design those events with traveller children and then they want to come, right? So we have to get the data piece right. We can't reduce it down to everybody who gets Arts Council funding has to report on a whole pile of data, because that actually puts the obligations on the people that we're trying to include to show up, and doesn't say if we've changed our organizations, if we've changed our programming, if we've changed our HR, if we've changed our building. So I suppose that's one risk, that we reduce it all down to numbers. What's more likely, I think, is a risk is we all try loads of things, very well intentioned, and nobody actually stops and co-designs it with people that it's designed for, and then takes the time to actually think what worked and what didn't. That we just go through a flurry of projects and activities, all of which eventually fall away because everyone's busy and scrapping around for funding. So I think really bringing this into the conscious critical thinking of the organization and systematizing how we approach it will be really important.
Thank you very much. Yeah, now if anyone wants to make any final comments, please put it in the chat now. But I think we're coming to the end of this session. We are going to have two more sessions. The next one is on the 16th of November, and that's focusing on what's happening in the sector right now, including presentations from initiatives from Skene Press, the Trans Writers Union, and others. And then we'll have another session on the 30th of November, which focuses on what's happening in the broader arts sector outside of the literature sector. And Maureen Kennelly and then Scarf and Alwyn Dahl will be contributing to that session along with others. And in each of those sessions, there will be an opportunity to return to this charter. So if you go away and you think about it and you want to make more comments, please do come to the next webinars, or as we said, you can make a contribution to info@Words Ireland, and that'll reach Brendan and he will pass it on to Nolan and it will feed into the considerations of what we do. But certainly we have heard that this should be a living charter, that we should find a way to make this work so that we have some process of reflection, whether that's an annual meeting or some other way. That there is anxiety about getting this right, that we are looking to people are afraid, and that's just part of the process. And then the idea that this be an authentic process and a real process that engages all elements of organizations and individuals is a very difficult thing to achieve, but that it's vital to the sector. So,
but
yeah, Owen. Oh, sorry. Once again, just a reminder there, I see if you want to email info@wordsireland.ie with any comments, please do. And I would like to apologise for the fact that there was no live captioning. We're aware somebody had to leave because they weren't able to access this webinar. We will, of course, now with the next two webinars, ensure that that is the case. And I'd like, on behalf of Words Ireland, I'd like to apologise for that. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. And hopefully at the end of the year, we will have a charter for inclusion, which Words Ireland will publish on their website. Thank you all very much.